Hey guys, tonight we are descending, and I mean that quite literally, into one of the most feared, most misunderstood, and most grimly fascinating places the medieval world ever produced. You are stepping into the dungeon. Not the romanticized Hollywood version with flickering torches casting dramatic shadows on conveniently dry stone walls, and not the fantasy role-playing version where you find a magic sword in a chest. No. Tonight's dungeon is cold, it is wet, it smells like something died in it because something probably did, and you, specifically you, are the newest resident. You probably won't survive this, if we're being entirely honest, and that cheerful little fact is exactly what we're going to explore together over the next several hours. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, drop a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there. I genuinely love knowing that someone in Auckland is drifting off at midnight while someone in Chicago is doing the same at 6 in the morning. All of us sinking into the same strange shared darkness together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It begins, as so many terrible things do, without warning. One moment you are simply existing, walking through a market, riding along a muddy road, perhaps standing in a great hall with a cup of something warm in your hand, and the next moment there are hands on you. Heavy hands. Hands wearing gauntlets or rough wool, or the specific grip of someone who has done this many times before and feels no particular urgency about it. You don't get an explanation right away. That is the first thing to understand about medieval arrest. The explanation, if it ever comes at all, is almost always an afterthought. The accusation follows the detention, not the other way around, and this simple reversal of the logic you've grown up expecting is the first of many reversals you will experience tonight. Let's say it's somewhere in the 12th or 13th century, because that's the dungeon's golden age, the period when castle architecture had matured enough to include serious subterranean infrastructure, when legal systems were just organized enough to require imprisonment but not nearly organized enough to make it humane, and when the political landscape of Europe was precisely chaotic enough that being on the wrong side of the wrong lord on the wrong afternoon could end your life's trajectory in a single afternoon. You exist in a world without presumption of innocence. You exist in a world where a powerful man's word is functionally the law, where the distance between a free person and a captive person is sometimes nothing more than one aristocrat's bad mood. The guards, and there are 3 of them because single-guard arrests were considered somewhat casual for anyone worth imprisoning properly, move you through the castle with the brisk efficiency of men who have somewhere else to be. You notice details in that hyper-focused way the human brain activates under stress. The way the light changes as you pass from the great hall into a corridor. The way the corridor slopes slightly downward almost immediately, the floor angling away beneath your feet with a subtlety that feels almost gentle at first, like the beginning of a dream where you don't yet know you're falling. The smell changes too. Above ground, a medieval castle smells of wood smoke, animal fat, damp wool, and the general aromatic complexity of several hundred people living in close proximity without access to modern plumbing. Below ground, all of that compresses and concentrates into something older and simpler and significantly worse. Here is your first mainstream historical fact of the evening. The word dungeon itself comes from the Old French word dungeon, which originally referred to the great tower of a castle, the keep, the most defensible and prestigious part of the whole structure. Lords and nobles lived in the dungeon. It was, counterintuitively, the good part. Over time, as castle architecture evolved and the lowest levels of these towers and the cellars dug beneath them became the places where prisoners were held, the word shifted downward, both physically and socially, until it came to mean specifically the pit, the cell, the underground prison. Language, like everything else in the medieval world, followed the logic of power. Words descended to match where the powerless were sent. The stairs, and stairs is perhaps generous. These are carved stone steps that were clearly never intended to be comfortable, worn smooth in the center by generations of reluctant feet, curved downward in a tight spiral. Spiral staircases in medieval castles were almost always designed to spiral clockwise when descending, which meant that a right-handed defender coming down from above had their sword arm toward the open center of the staircase, with room to swing. A right-handed attacker coming up from below had their sword arm pressed against the outer wall, cramped and useless. Even the architecture was arguing against you. Everything here, you begin to understand, was designed by people who thought seriously about control, about advantage, about the physics of domination. You pass a door. Heavy oak, iron-banded, with a lock the size of a small animal. Behind it, nothing you can hear, which is either reassuring or deeply alarming depending on your disposition, and right now your disposition is not great. The guard at your left, the one who has been holding your arm with that infuriating casual confidence, like he's escorting a slightly unruly child rather than an adult human being who presumably has feelings about the situation. Glances at the door and then glances away. Just a glance. Just a small, professional acknowledgement of something he has learned not to think too much about. The legal framework that has delivered you here is worth pausing on, because it illuminates something important about how medieval imprisonment differed from what you're accustomed to thinking about. In much of medieval Europe, particularly between the 10th and 14th centuries, imprisonment was not, in itself, a standard judicial punishment. This surprises most modern listeners. You might expect that if you committed a crime, the sentence would be a certain number of years in prison, the way it works today. But for much of the medieval period, prisons and dungeons were not primarily punitive institutions. They were holding facilities. You were kept there while you awaited something else. A trial, an execution, the payment of a ransom, the resolution of a political situation, the death of an enemy who wanted you contained. Historians still argue whether this distinction between imprisonment as process and imprisonment as punishment actually made medieval detention better or worse in practice, since the conditions were brutal regardless of intent. And awaiting something in a medieval dungeon could mean awaiting it for decades. The guards stop. There is a door, smaller than the one you passed, lower ceilinged, requiring the tallest guard to duck slightly, which he does with the automatic familiarity of long habit. A key appears from somewhere. A large, heavy, iron key that looks exactly like every key in every fairy tale you have ever encountered, which is not comforting but is at least consistent. The lock does not turn smoothly. It requires effort, a specific angle, a small grunt of force that suggests this mechanism is older than anyone currently present and has opinions about being operated. There is a sound that you will come to know intimately over the coming days. The specific grinding, clanking, resonant finality of a medieval cell door being opened. It is a sound made of iron and damp air and the particular acoustics of stone rooms, and it carries within it the full weight of your new situation. You are guided, and again, guided is doing some heavy lifting here. Deposited might be more accurate, into the space beyond. The door closes behind you. The key turns. The guard's footsteps recede up the spiral stairs, unhurried, the sound bouncing off stone until it fades into a silence so complete it has a texture to it, a presence, a weight that settles onto your shoulders like something physical. This is the moment, historians and psychologists agree, that defines the dungeon experience more than any other single instant. Not the arrest, not the first sight of the cell, the moment the footsteps stop. Because in that silence you are confronted, for the first time, with the true nature of your situation. You are underground, in stone, in darkness, in a place specifically designed to keep you exactly where you are, and you have absolutely no idea what happens next or when. Let's talk about what justice looked like getting you here, because the process that preceded your arrival in this cell was, by modern standards, extraordinary in its informality. In the medieval world, depending on your era and location, you might have been arrested on the direct order of a lord or king with no further explanation required. You might have been the subject of an accusation made by a neighbor, a rival, or an enemy, with that accusation carrying significant weight simply because of who made it. You might have been caught in what was called the act, a legal concept that existed across most of medieval European jurisprudence and which essentially meant that being found doing something was considered evidence enough that you had done it, a position of logical circularity that was apparently not considered problematic at the time. The quirky historical tidbit that earns its place in this section involves the specific legal concept of appeal of felony in medieval English law. Under this mechanism, a private individual, not the crown, not an official, just a regular person, could formally accuse another person of a felony, and the two of them might be required to settle the matter through trial by combat, a judicial duel. The idea being that God would ensure the righteous party won. If you were accused and you lost the fight, you were hanged immediately after. If you won the fight, the accuser was hanged. This system, which sounds like something invented by someone who had been in a dungeon themselves for too long, remained technically on the books in England until 1819, when a man named Abraham Thornton was accused of murder and had the audacity to actually invoke his right to trial by combat, causing such legal pandemonium that Parliament abolished the practice almost immediately. Medieval legal innovation, surprising people for centuries. But you didn't get trial by combat. You got the stairs, the key, the door, the silence. What you also got, though you don't yet fully appreciate this, is a location. And location, in the medieval prison system, tells you something important about your status and your prospects. The deeper into the castle you were placed, the more significant your case was considered, and significance was a double-edged condition. High-status prisoners, political captives, wealthy hostages awaiting ransom. These people were sometimes kept in relatively tolerable conditions because they were valuable. They might be housed in tower rooms rather than underground cells, with actual furniture, actual light, perhaps even actual visitors. The lower you went, the less valuable you were considered, or the more dangerous, or both. You friend went all the way down, which means something, and that something is not encouraging. The castle above you continues its life. Somewhere up there, several meters of stone overhead, there are fires burning and food cooking and arguments happening and dogs barking and children running through corridors and lords conducting business and servants carrying laundry and all of the exhausting, complicated, loud, warm, aromatic business of medieval human existence. All of that is continuing, absolutely indifferent to the fact that you are no longer part of it. You are underneath it. The wall against your back is cold enough that you can feel it through your clothing. The floor under you is stone, also cold, also damp, with a roughness that suggests it was never finished to any particular standard because finishing it never seemed like a priority. The darkness around you is not quite complete. There is, somewhere above and to your left, an aperture in the wall so narrow it barely deserves the word window, through which a quantity of light enters that is technically distinguishable from no light at all, but only technically. You sit with your back against the wall, in the classic position of the newly imprisoned since the beginning of time, and you try to take stock. Your clothes are what you were wearing when they took you. No one offered you alternatives. No one offered you a blanket, though the temperature down here sits at the kind of cool that your body, conditioned by a lifetime of climate control, immediately registers as wrong, as insufficient, as requiring a response that is not available to you. No one gave you water. No one gave you any food. No one told you when any of these things might change. What they did give you, and what you are just beginning to notice as your eyes adjust, the human eye being a remarkable instrument that will find what light there is and do its best with it, is company. Movement near the base of the opposite wall. A rustling along the join between floor and stone. Something that pauses, assesses you from a distance of perhaps 2 meters with the calm confidence of an established resident evaluating new competition, and then resumes whatever it was doing. You have a roommate. Several roommates, probably, though the others have not yet introduced themselves. This is the dungeon's first lesson, delivered within minutes of your arrival. You are not alone down here, and the company you keep is entirely out of your choosing. The medieval dungeon is an ecosystem, complete and self-sustaining, with its own food chains and its own politics and its own rhythms, and you have just been dropped into the middle of it with no orientation materials whatsoever. Welcome, the darkness seems to say, with the gentle sarcasm of a host who knows perfectly well you had no choice about accepting the invitation. You are going to want to know what comes next. We are going to cover every terrible detail, the cell itself, the food, the guards, the sickness, the slow architectural dismantling of your mind, the instruments of persuasion in the interrogation room, the vanishingly small selection of exits. We are going to go through all of it together slowly in the dark. Get comfortable, or as comfortable as stone permits. The darkness you discover is not uniform. This surprises you. You had assumed, in that vague, pre-dungeon way you assumed things when darkness was still just an inconvenience rather than a permanent condition, that underground imprisonment would mean a single, consistent, total blackness. A simple absence of light. But the darkness of your cell is a layered thing, a geological thing, with different densities at different distances and different qualities at different hours. Near the slit of a window, if the sun is at the right angle, and the sun is only at the right angle for perhaps 40 minutes out of every 24 hours, there is something almost approaching dim. Away from the window, toward the back wall and the corners, the darkness achieves a depth that feels less like the absence of light and more like the presence of something else entirely. Something patient. Something that has been here considerably longer than you have and intends to be here considerably longer still. Your eyes have now done everything they can do. They have dilated to their maximum capacity. They have recruited every photoreceptor available to the task. They have performed, in short, a heroic biological effort, and the result of that effort is that you can see, approximately, the general shape of the room. The walls, the floor, the door, the outline of whatever is moving along the base of the far wall. This is the ceiling of your visual capability down here, and you have reached it within the first hour. So let's actually look at what you're living in, because the physical reality of a medieval dungeon cell is one of those topics that sounds straightforward until you start examining the specifics, at which point it becomes a masterclass in human ingenuity applied to the problem of making another human being as miserable as possible while technically keeping them alive. The first thing to understand is the size. Medieval dungeon cells varied considerably depending on the castle, the era, the purpose of the imprisonment, and presumably the mood of whoever commissioned the construction. But the cells preserved in historical records and surviving castle archaeology, places like the Tower of London, Chillon Castle on Lake Geneva, Warwick Castle, the Chateau Gallard in Normandy, tend toward the compact. A generous cell might measure 3 meters by 4 meters. A less generous one might be 2 meters by 2 meters, which, if you've ever stood in a space that size, you know is not a room so much as a very emphatic suggestion that you stop existing laterally. Some cells were smaller still. The oubliette, a word that comes from the French oublier, meaning to forget, was sometimes nothing more than a vertical shaft in the floor, accessed by a trapdoor above, in which a prisoner could stand or squat but not lie down. A spatial argument so brutal in its implications that the very word has carried its horror intact through 8 centuries of linguistic evolution. You are not in an oubliette. This is good news. You are in something slightly more generous, perhaps 2.5 meters by 3, with a ceiling just high enough that you can stand upright if you stand in the center, though the ceiling slopes toward the walls in a way that turns the edges of your cell into crouching territory. The walls are cut stone, mortared together with what was once lime mortar and is now something more organic, more complex, more alive in the microbiological sense. The floor is also stone, though the floor has the additional feature of not being entirely level. It tilts very slightly toward a channel cut along the base of the left wall, a drainage groove that was, in theory, designed to carry water and waste toward a gap in the outer foundation. In theory. In practice, the channel is partially blocked by sediment, by organic material of ambiguous origin, by centuries of accumulation, and the tilting floor simply ensures that whatever liquid exists in your cell pools slowly toward the left wall, where it sits and contributes to the general atmosphere. The smell. We should discuss the smell, because the smell of a medieval dungeon cell is not a single smell. It is a committee of smells, each one contributing its particular expertise to the overall effect. There is the base note, which is mineral and cold, the smell of stone that has been wet for centuries, the smell of geological time compressed into a few cubic meters. On top of that sits the biological layer, mold, of course, in several varieties, some of it visible on the walls as dark patches in the mortar joints, some of it invisible but present in the air as spores that you are already breathing, that are already beginning their quiet negotiation with your respiratory system. Then there is the animal component, the specific contribution of the rodents and insects and other creatures who have established residency here, their nesting materials, their waste, their deceased. And finally, underneath and through all of it, there is a human element. The accumulated presence of everyone who has occupied this cell before you, which is a thought so heavy that you set it down almost immediately and decide not to pick it back up. Here is your mainstream historical fact for this section: the Tower of London, which is arguably the most famous prison in medieval and early modern European history, held its first notable prisoner in 1100, a bishop named Ranulph Flambard, who had the additional distinction of being the first person to escape from it, which he accomplished by smuggling in a rope with a barrel of wine, getting his guards extremely drunk at a celebratory dinner, and climbing out of a window. Historians note this with the kind of restrained admiration that academics permit themselves when something genuinely audacious occurs in the historical record. Ranulph clearly understood something important. In the dungeon, your most valuable resource is not strength or bravado. It is creativity, and your most exploitable resource in other people is always their appetite. But back to your cell, which lacks the Tower of London's relative grandeur and definitely lacks an escape rope. The walls, you discover upon closer inspection, and you have time for close inspection, you have nothing but time, are not blank. They are a palimpsest. Layers of human presence inscribed directly into stone by people who, like you, had time and desperation in equal measure. Some of it is simple, lines scratched in groups of 5, the universal notation of someone counting days. You can see several such tallies, some of them running to numbers you don't particularly want to count. Some are more elaborate, crude drawings, figures that might be people or animals or both, geometric patterns that suggest either artistic ambition or the beginning of the kind of mental state where geometry becomes very important. Some are words, though the languages represented span several centuries, and your ability to read medieval Latin, Old French, and Middle English is, you discover, worse than you'd hoped. One inscription near the floor, at the level where someone lying down might have pressed their face against the stone, is simply a name. Just a name, scratched with care, with something that reads almost like deliberateness. Like someone who understood they might not leave this place and wanted to ensure that something of themselves remained after they were gone. Historians still argue whether such inscriptions represent defiance, despair, hope, or simply the human compulsion to mark one's presence in a world that seems committed to erasing it. You run your finger along the letters and feel the depth of each groove and think about the tool that made them. A nail, maybe, or a piece of metal picked up from the floor, used methodically over hours or days, and the thought settles into you alongside the cold. The floor situation deserves its own paragraph, specifically because it is the surface with which you will be having the most intimate relationship. You are going to sleep on this floor. You might be given straw at some point. Straw was the standard medieval prison bedding, a layer of it scattered across the stone. But the straw situation in a dungeon cell exists on a spectrum from fresh enough to provide minimal insulation, to so old and damp and colonized by wildlife that it functions primarily as habitat rather than bedding. What you have right now, on your first night, is the unmediated stone itself. It is approximately the temperature of everything else down here, which is to say cold enough to matter but not cold enough to constitute the primary crisis. The primary crisis is still being determined. The quirky tidbit that belongs in this section concerns a feature found in certain medieval cells called the larmire, or weeping stone. In some dungeon constructions, the architects, and it is strange to think that someone with genuine architectural training sat down and designed these spaces, incorporated a slight inward slope to the ceiling directly above the prisoner's sleeping area, combined with a cold meeting warm air dynamic in the cell, which caused condensation to form on the ceiling and drip steadily downward onto the prisoner while they slept. This may have been accidental, a byproduct of the construction, or it may have been intentional, a low-grade, continuous, technically non-violent form of harassment that required no guard to administer and operated 24 hours a day. The debate among historians of medieval architecture is whether this was engineered cruelty or merely engineered indifference, and the uncomfortable answer may be that in the medieval carceral context, the distinction between those two things was not considered particularly important. You have discovered your own version of this phenomenon. A point on the ceiling directly above the area where you have instinctively settled, backs always go to walls. It's apparently a hardwired human preference, from which water drips with metronomic regularity. Not fast, not slow. Exactly the pace that ensures you cannot ignore it, cannot predict it precisely enough to stop anticipating it, cannot get used to it. Drip, pause, drip, pause. It will continue for the entire night. You know this already, in the same way you know that the stone won't get softer and the smell won't improve and the darkness won't lift until that 40-minute window of opportunity comes around again tomorrow. The wildlife situation, which you registered in your first minutes and then tried very hard not to think about, demands acknowledgement. Your cell contains rats. This is not speculation. You can hear them, you can occasionally see the movement of them in the dimness, and you have already experienced the unsettling sensation of something small and confident running across your foot with the calm of an entity that considers this territory its own and views you as the intruder. Rats in medieval dungeons were not incidental nuisances. They were an ecological constant, a permanent feature of the environment, as reliably present as the cold stone and the damp air. They were there because prisoners had food, or at least prisoners had the remnants of food, the crumbs, the scraps, the biological material that accumulates wherever humans exist. And where food exists, rats follow with the committed consistency of creatures who have been perfecting this strategy for millions of years. The relationship between medieval prisoners and dungeon rats was, by historical accounts, complex. Some prisoners, particularly those imprisoned for long periods, develop something approaching coexistence with the rat population. Not friendship exactly, but a negotiated territorial understanding. You stay on that side of the cell, I'll stay on this side. We'll both agree not to make things worse than they already are. Some prisoners, particularly those who were desperate enough and pragmatic enough, ate them. Rat as protein supplement, rat as the dungeon's answer to the protein bar. This will seem more reasonable to you in a few days than it does right now, which tells you something important about the trajectory you're on. Beyond the rats, the insect population is comprehensive. Fleas, lice, and various beetles have staked claims throughout the cell's ecosystem, and they will stake claims on you as well, with a thoroughness that will make itself known through the night as an ever-present, low-grade, maddeningly diffuse itching that you cannot fully localize or address. Lice in particular were so universal in medieval dungeons, and in medieval life generally, that their presence was simply assumed, a baseline condition of the era. The specific horror of dungeon lice, as opposed to the generalized medieval lice experience, was the density of them. Confined spaces, limited ability to clean oneself, no access to the herbal remedies and laundering practices that people above ground used to manage the situation. You scratch your arm, then your neck, then a place on your ankle that you cannot reach easily because of how you're sitting. You rearrange yourself, which involves sliding slightly on the stone and discovering two things. First, that the stone has a roughness that engages with fabric in a destructive way, and second, that there is no position on this floor that is categorically better than any other position. They are all variations on the same fundamental problem, which is that you are a soft organism attempting to rest on a hard surface that was not designed with your comfort as a consideration. Your hips will be the first to register a serious complaint. Then your shoulders. Then, in a development that will seem almost philosophical in its persistence, the back of your skull. The temperature settles. It has been settling since you arrived, moving toward the dungeon's baseline, which is the temperature of the earth itself at this depth, around 10 to 12 degrees Celsius, which your body, accustomed to the comfortable regulated environments of modern life, reads as significantly colder than it is. This is partly because of the dampness, which conducts heat away from your skin more efficiently than dry air, and partly because you are sitting still, and sitting still is not an efficient way to generate body heat. And partly because somewhere in the back of your mind you are cold in a way that has nothing to do with temperature. The night, assuming it is night, you cannot actually verify this from where you sit, stretches ahead of you. You do what humans in dungeons have always done on their first night. You sit with your back against the wall. You draw your knees toward your chest in a gesture that is equal parts thermal management and psychological self-protection. You listen to the sounds of the space around you. The drip, the faint movement of things along the floor, the distant and barely audible sounds of the castle above, the profound silence that frames all of this, and you think. You think about how you got here. You think about who knows you're here. You think, with a specificity and urgency that surprises you, about warmth, about light, about the particular comfort of a bed, a real bed, with weight and softness and the accumulated warmth of your own body held around you. That bed, wherever it is very far away right now. The stone is not going to help you find it. But the night is long, and we are going to spend it together, and there is still so much to cover. Morning arrives not as light but as sound. Somewhere above you, the castle wakes, muffled, distant, transmitted through several meters of stone as a kind of geological rumor of activity rather than anything you can clearly identify. Footsteps, maybe, the movement of something heavy across a floor. The faint, almost hallucinatory suggestion of voices. You have not slept, or you have slept in the fractured, unconvincing way that stone floors and cold air and relentless dripping permit, brief descents into something that resembles unconsciousness more than rest, punctuated by sharp returns to full awareness every time your hip makes its feelings known or something small and confident decides to investigate the area near your left hand. But morning, such as it is, carries with it a specific promise in the dungeon. Food. or at least the possibility of food, the idea of food, the abstract hope that at some point in the coming hours, a door will open and something edible will enter your world. You have been holding onto this hope with both hands since approximately the second hour of your imprisonment. When your stomach, which has not been consulted on any of the decisions that led you here and is frankly furious about the whole situation, began making its position known in terms impossible to ignore. So let's talk about what you're going to eat down here. Or more precisely, let's talk about what will be handed to you, and whether eating is quite the right verb for what you'll be doing with it. The standard medieval dungeon diet, documented across enough historical sources that we can speak about it with some confidence, was built on two pillars, bread and water. This sounds simple. It sounds almost manageable, in the way that simple things sometimes sound manageable before you examine them closely. The bread was not the bread you are thinking of. The water was not the water you are imagining. And bread and water, as a complete dietary profile for a human being who is also dealing with cold, stress, physical inactivity, and the full biological assault of the dungeon environment, is not a neutral nutritional statement. It is a slow-motion medical emergency dressed up as a meal plan. The bread arrived, when it arrived, which was not guaranteed to be daily, in the form of a rough loaf made from whatever grain was cheapest and most available. In prosperous times and prosperous regions, this might be rye or barley bread, dense and dark and nutritionally adequate if you were eating enough of it and supplementing it with other things which you were not. In leaner times, the grain might be mixed with other materials, dried peas, bean flour, sometimes substances that modern food science would classify as adulterants rather than ingredients, to extend it further. The loaf would be old. Not day-old, which is merely stale, but several days old, which in the damp environment of a dungeon accelerates through stale into something more interesting from a mycological standpoint. You are going to eat moldy bread. This is not a worst-case scenario, this is the median case. The mold on dungeon bread was so standard and so expected that there is evidence prisoners sometimes specifically requested the moldier portions, having learned through dungeon folk wisdom what scientists would not formally establish until Alexander Fleming's penicillin work in the 20th century, that certain bread molds have antimicrobial properties. This is your quirky historical tidbit, and it is genuinely extraordinary medieval prisoners, through pure empirical observation with no theoretical framework whatsoever, working out that the fuzzy blue-green stuff on their bread was somehow medicinally useful. They were not wrong. They were, in fact, doing proto-science in the most terrible possible laboratory conditions, because when your experimental environment is a medieval dungeon, the motivation to identify anything that might help you survive is extremely high. The water situation is its own chapter of misery. Water reached dungeon prisoners through several mechanisms, none of them reliable and all of them compromised. In some castles, water was carried down by guards or servants in buckets or clay jugs, a system entirely dependent on the willingness of those guards and servants to make the trip regularly, which willingness fluctuated based on factors entirely outside your control. In other cells, water seeped through the walls directly, collecting in low points on the floor, which meant your drinking water was essentially the same water that was making your floor damp, filtered through however many meters of stone and soil and the accumulated history of whatever had happened in the spaces above. Some dungeon cells had a dedicated water channel, again theoretically supplying fresh water, though fresh in this context meant moving rather than clean in any sense that would satisfy modern standards. The water was almost certainly contaminated. This is not a dramatic statement. It is a simple consequence of the infrastructure. Medieval understanding of waterborne illness was, to put it charitably, incomplete. The germ theory of disease would not arrive until the 19th century, and without it, there was no framework for understanding why the water from certain sources made people sick and others did not. What people understood was that some water tasted bad and some tasted acceptable, and they applied this sensory heuristic as best they could, which was not well enough. Your water, coming through stone and soil that also supported the dungeon's extensive rodent population, carrying whatever the rodent population contributed to it in passing, is water that your modern immune system, not primed by a lifetime of exposure to medieval waterborne pathogens, is going to find extremely challenging. But here's the thing, you are thirsty. You have been thirsty since before the guards brought you down here, and you are going to become significantly more thirsty before anything changes. And thirst, genuine deep thirst, is one of those physical experiences that systematically dismantles priorities. Things that seemed important, like the question of water quality, like the general principle of not drinking water that has passed through a rat-adjacent filtration system, become negotiable in ways they are not when you are merely theoretically thirsty rather than actually thirsty. You will drink what you are given. You will drink it with the focused urgency of a body demanding to be maintained, and then you will deal with the consequences, which will arrive in their own time with the reliability of everything else unpleasant in this place. The door opens. This is the first time the door has opened since they closed it behind you, and the psychological impact of that opening, the sound of the lock, the scrape of the door on its uneven stone threshold, the sudden influx of slightly less terrible air from the corridor, is disproportionate to what actually enters. What actually enters is a guard you haven't seen before, or possibly the same guard in worse light, carrying a wooden bowl and a clay jug. The bowl contains something. The jug contains water. The guard sets both items on the floor inside the door with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done this many times and found that the less time spent in the cell, the better, and the door closes again before you have fully processed what just happened. You are across the room before you consciously decide to move. The bowl contains pottage. This is the word pottage, and it deserves a moment of attention because it represents the medieval world's most democratic and most flexible food concept. Pottage was essentially anything that had been boiled in water until it reached a consistency somewhere between soup and porridge. Grain usually. Vegetables when available, whatever was growing, whatever was cheap, whatever was surplus from the castle kitchen above. Occasionally, in particularly generous or particularly well-resourced establishments, something that had once been an animal might make an appearance, contributing both protein and flavor to the general proceedings. What you have in this bowl is pottage at the dungeon end of the pottage spectrum, which means it has been made from the minimum viable ingredients with the minimum viable effort, and it is warm, which is the single most important fact about it. It is warm and it exists, and right now these two qualities make it the most appealing thing in your world. The taste is, well, the taste is an experience. The grain is overcooked to the point where it has abandoned any pretension of texture and simply become a paste, a starchy, vaguely savory paste with an undertone of something you cannot identify and decide not to investigate. There is salt, perhaps, or something that the medieval kitchen considered analogous to salt. There are no distinct vegetables, though there might have been vegetables at some earlier point in this liquid's history. You eat it with your hands because no utensil has been provided, which is itself a statement about how your hosts regard the need to facilitate your dining experience, and you eat it with a speed and totality that surprises you. Every scrape of the bowl, every trace of paste extracted from the rough wood, consumed with the efficiency of a body that has recalibrated its standards significantly downward in the past several hours. The water you drink more cautiously, not because caution seems wise in any abstract sense, but because your body, even in its current state of urgent need, registers something about the water that prompts an instinctive slowing. It is slightly cloudy. It has a mineral quality that is not quite the neutral mineral quality of spring water, but something more complex, more layered. It is cold, genuinely cold, which is both welcome and alarming. Welcome because cold water is somehow more convincingly water-like than warm water, and alarming because the coldness suggests it has come from underground sources, which is exactly the source situation you were already worried about. You drink half the jug. You set the rest down. You sit back and wait to see what your body thinks about all of this. Your body, it turns out, has thoughts. The mainstream historical fact for this section concerns the formal regulation of prison diets in medieval England, specifically the legal concept of the diet of bread and water as a judicial sentence in its own right, separate from imprisonment, a specific punishment applied to prisoners who violated dungeon rules or who were being subjected to additional pressure. Royal records from the 13th and 14th centuries contain explicit references to prisoners being placed on reduced rations as a coercive measure, particularly in cases where information was being sought or cooperation was being encouraged. The quantity specified in some of these records is precise and chilling, measured amounts of bread per day, often expressed in terms of the number of loaves of a specific size, calculated, it seems, to keep a person alive at a level of function sufficient for them to remain useful, which is a form of nutritional calculus that tells you everything you need to know about how the people running these places thought about the people in them. The problem with your diet, beyond the obvious problem of its inadequacy, is the nutritional architecture of it. Bread and pottage, even supplemented with the occasional protein source, is a diet constructed almost entirely of carbohydrates. The protein is minimal. The fat is minimal. The vitamins are minimal in ways that will become consequential over time. Vitamin C in particular, abundant in fresh fruits and vegetables, is absent from dungeon cuisine in any meaningful quantity. And the human body's relationship with vitamin C deficiency follows a timeline that is both well-documented and deeply unpleasant. Scurvy takes weeks to months to manifest fully, but its early stages, fatigue, irritability, aching joints, gums that begin to show the first signs of unhappiness, can begin within a few weeks of inadequate intake. You have been here less than 24 hours, so this is a future problem rather than a present one, but the dungeon is a patient place and it is already setting up the conditions for it. Historians still argue whether the medieval prison diet represented deliberate deprivation, a conscious tool of punishment and coercion, or simply the extension of the poverty diet of the medieval lower classes, who also ate bread and pottage and not much else, into a context where even those minimal standards were inconsistently maintained. The argument matters because it touches on questions of intent. Were dungeon administrators deliberately engineering nutritional suffering, or were they simply indifferent, applying to prisoners the same minimal resource allocation they applied to everyone at the bottom of the social hierarchy? The answer is probably both, varying by institution, by era, by the individual temperament of whoever was in charge, and by the perceived importance of the prisoner, which is to say, the dungeon diet was as arbitrary as everything else about medieval imprisonment, shaped more by circumstance than by any coherent policy. You discover mid-morning of your first full day, measuring time by the movement of that thin blade of light across the floor, a sundial of deprivation, that you are hungry again. Not the theoretical hunger of someone who has missed a meal, but the insistent, focused, whole-body hunger of someone whose caloric intake has dropped precipitously below their metabolic needs. The pottage helped. It helped the way a single sandbag helps with a flood. It addressed the urgency without resolving the situation. You are calculating, in the back of your mind, the interval between the morning delivery and whatever might come next, and you are calculating it against the hunger, and the hunger is winning. The jug is still half full. You drink a little more. Your stomach, which had been conducting a separate inquiry into the pottage's provenance, delivers a preliminary report that is ambiguous but not catastrophic. The water, similarly, seems to be in negotiation with your immune system rather than outright conflict. You are technically functioning. You are cold and hungry and unwashed and sitting on stone in the dark with rats, but you are functioning, and at this particular stage of dungeon inhabitation, that is the metric that matters. What you are not doing, and what you will find increasingly difficult to do as the days accumulate, is thriving. The dungeon diet is not a diet that permits thriving. It is a diet that permits existing at a level of existence calibrated to the minimum required to maintain the specific usefulness you represent to whoever put you here. Above that minimum, resources are not spent. Below that minimum, problems arise that complicate administrative matters. The line is thin, it is inconsistently maintained, and you are standing on it in the dark, eating moldy bread, and calling it breakfast. Somewhere above, the castle is having lunch. You can almost smell it, or perhaps you are imagining you can smell it, which is its own kind of cruelty. The dungeon offering you the ghost of nourishment, the phantom of warmth and flavor, and the simple animal comfort of eating enough. Your brain, which is a remarkable instrument in its way, is already beginning the adaptive process of learning this new normal, filing away the hunger and the cold and the smell as background conditions rather than acute emergencies. Because that is what brains do when emergencies become permanent. They reclassify them not to make them better, but to make them survivable. This reclassification is both your greatest asset down here and one of the most quietly alarming things happening to you, because it means you are already changing, and you have been here less than a day. The bowl sits empty by the door. The jug is mostly empty. The rats have noticed both and are conducting their own assessment from a respectful but interested distance, and you look at them and they look at you, and for a moment the power dynamic in this cell is genuinely unclear. Then your stomach rumbles again, and the rats apparently take this as a verdict in their favor, and they resume their business. You settle back against the wall. The day stretches ahead. The key in the lock again. You have already learned to read the sound the way a sailor reads the sky, with full attention, with the understanding that what follows will matter. The grinding, the clank, the specific resistance of old iron working against old iron, and then the scrape of the door, and then a figure in the doorway that is neither the guard who brought your morning pottage nor either of the men who delivered you here yesterday. This one is older, broader. He moves into the doorway rather than through it, occupying the frame with the easy authority of someone who understands that the threshold is a power position and has no intention of surrendering it unnecessarily. He looks at you with the particular expression of a man conducting a routine assessment. Not unkind, not kind, entirely professional, the way a farmer looks at livestock. And then he nods once as if you have confirmed something he already suspected, and he withdraws and the door closes, and you are alone again. That was the jailer. And the jailer, it turns out, is the most important person in your life right now. More important than the Lord who ordered your imprisonment. More important than whatever magistrate or court might eventually convene to consider your case. More important in the immediate practical sense than God, though you are probably praying to God with some regularity at this point, because when options are limited, you work through the list. The jailer controls your food, your water, your light, your bedding, your access to other prisoners, your access to visitors, the temperature of your food when it arrives, the frequency of its arrival, and roughly 100 other variables that constitute the difference between surviving this experience and not. He is the most powerful person you have ever been this dependent on, and you know almost nothing about him. Let's fix that. The professional world of medieval dungeon keeping was, by the standards of medieval employment, a reasonably stable and moderately compensated position. Jailers, sometimes called jailers, from the old French geôlier, sometimes given more specific titles depending on the institution and the era, were typically appointed rather than elected, often by the constable of the castle or the sheriff of the county, and they held their positions with a tenure that could extend for decades. This longevity was both a feature and a bug. A jailer who had been managing the same dungeon for 20 years knew it with an intimacy that made him very good at his job. Where very good at his job encompasses both the ability to prevent escapes and the ability to extract maximum value from the prisoners under his care through mechanisms that were not always strictly official. Because here is the thing about medieval jailers that transforms your understanding of your situation: they were almost universally underpaid relative to the responsibilities of their position, and the gap between their official compensation and their actual income was filled by the prisoners themselves. The system of prisoner fees, sometimes called garnish in English prison tradition, was an institutionalized practice so deeply embedded in the economics of medieval imprisonment that it functioned essentially as a parallel economy. Prisoners were expected to pay for almost everything. Food beyond the basic bread and water allotment, fee. A candle, fee. Straw for bedding, fee. The removal of heavy chains and irons, fee. Access to a slightly better cell, fee. Permission to receive visitors, fee. The guarantee that the jailer would not make your life significantly worse through any of the 1,000 small adjustments to your environment that were within his power. Ongoing fee, essentially a retainer, a subscription service to not being actively maltreated. This is your mainstream historical fact for this section, and it is one that genuinely reframes the dungeon experience. The medieval prison was not a state-administered system of uniform suffering, but a market. A terrible market with profound power imbalances and no consumer protections whatsoever, but a market nonetheless, in which the currency was money or goods or information or social connection, and in which your outcomes were substantially determined by your ability to participate in the exchange. Wealthy prisoners, nobles, merchants, politically significant captives, could purchase conditions that were, while still imprisonment, almost recognizably livable. Better food, better quarters, books sometimes, exercise in a courtyard, the company of servants brought from outside. Richard I of England, held captive in the German castle of Dürnstein in 1192 while returning from the Third Crusade, was technically a prisoner but lived in conditions that most of his subjects outside the dungeon would have envied. The ransom demanded for his release, 150,000 marks, an almost incomprehensible sum, suggests that his captors understood perfectly well the relationship between prisoner value and prisoner treatment. You, sitting in your cell with no money and no obvious political value, are at the other end of this market. But you are not entirely without options, which is important to understand. The jailer who just looked at you is not your enemy in the simple sense. He is a businessman in a system where you are simultaneously his product, his customer, and his primary professional responsibility. He wants you alive. Dead prisoners generate paperwork and awkward questions from above. He wants you functional. Non-functional prisoners require additional resources and attract unwanted attention. He wants, if at all possible, to extract from you whatever value you represent, whether that is information, ransom potential, or the fees you might pay for marginally better conditions. These interests, while not aligned with your preferences in any comfortable sense, do create a space for negotiation that a purely punitive system would not. The guards are a separate study. Where the jailer is an institution, a fixed point around which the dungeon's economy orbits, the guards are more variable, younger, generally less invested in the long-term management of the space, more susceptible to the full range of human emotional weather. Some guards were cruel in the active, creative sense. People who had found, in the dungeon's power structure, an outlet for something in themselves that had nowhere else to go. Some were indifferent with the practiced efficiency of people who had learned not to think too much about the nature of their work. Some, and this is perhaps the most interesting category, were susceptible to the thing that has undermined institutional hierarchies since the beginning of time, which is human connection. Prisoners who managed to establish any kind of personal relationship with their guards. Not friendship, exactly, the power differential made genuine friendship essentially impossible, but something in the vicinity of recognized humanity, fared measurably better. A guard who knew your name, who had heard you speak about something outside the context of your imprisonment, who had registered you as a person rather than simply an occupant of a cell, was a guard slightly less likely to forget your water or to take an extra day between food deliveries or to look the other way when conditions in your cell deteriorated below even the dungeon's flexible minimum standards. Historians still argue whether this humanizing impulse in prisoner-guard relationships was more beneficial or more dangerous for prisoners. The argument runs like this: on one hand, guards who saw prisoners as people were more likely to provide small mercies. On the other hand, guards who became genuinely sympathetic to a prisoner sometimes created expectations of special treatment, of information exchange, of complicity in minor rule violations that could, if the relationship was discovered or if the guard's loyalties shifted, result in significantly worse treatment than indifferent neglect would have produced. The dungeon relationship economy was complex, unstable, and operated without any of the legal protections that modern employees and employers at least nominally enjoy. The social architecture of the dungeon extended beyond the jailer and guards to include a third population you have not yet encountered but will: other prisoners. Whether you are in a single occupancy cell, which your current situation suggests, or in a communal holding space, which was equally common and significantly more complex, you exist within a prisoner community whose dynamics were as intricate and as consequential as any social structure above ground. Communal cells, sometimes called common prisons or common jails, held multiple prisoners together in a space that was not meaningfully larger than what you have now, and the social order that emerged in these spaces was both spontaneous and rigid, hierarchies establishing themselves within days, resource allocation systems developing, informal codes of conduct enforced by the community itself with an efficiency that the official jailer system sometimes envied. The quirky tidbit here involves a specific figure in medieval English prison culture, known as the prisoner's steward or sometimes the lord of the whole. In larger communal cells, the most powerful prisoner, usually determined by a combination of physical dominance, social status carried in from outside, and the crucial economic factor of who had the most money to spend on the garnish system, effectively managed the internal economy of the cell. They controlled where people slept, mediated disputes, and often ran a secondary fee system within the prisoner community itself. New arrivals to communal cells were expected to pay garnish not just to the jailer but to the lord of the whole, a contribution described in various contemporary sources as a kind of initiation fee, a cover charge for the privilege of existing within the cell's social order. Those who couldn't or wouldn't pay faced social exclusion from whatever small comforts the community had pooled to create. And in the communal cell, social exclusion was not a minor inconvenience but a potentially life-threatening condition. You are in a single cell, which means you are spared the lord of the whole's attention but also denied the communal cell's occasional advantages. Shared body warmth, the psychological benefit of human company, the possibility of assistance when conditions deteriorated. Single-cell imprisonment was, paradoxically, both a privilege, usually reserved for higher-status prisoners, and in some respects a more psychologically severe condition, for reasons we will explore in considerable depth later tonight. For now, the sound of activity in the corridor again. Not the jailer this time, the footsteps are lighter, quicker, less authoritative. A guard, young from the sound of it, and with him the specific acoustic signature of a bucket being carried, the sloshing of liquid against wooden staves. It emerges as the door opens briefly, not your water delivery but the daily, theoretically daily, actually when someone gets around to it, waste removal service, which is a generous name for a guard placing an empty bucket inside your door to replace the one already in your cell that has been serving as your toilet since your arrival. The sanitation situation in medieval dungeons was, to nobody's surprise, not good. In better resourced establishments, a channel in the floor connected to an exterior drainage system handled some of the waste. In less resourced ones, a bucket was the entire sanitation infrastructure, emptied at intervals that were inconsistent enough that interval flatters the regularity. The waste from the bucket, combined with the general dampness of the cell and the contributions of the rodent population, created a microbiological environment that is difficult to describe without reaching for the vocabulary of public health disaster. The smell, as you have already discovered, is a living thing. It changes throughout the day as temperature shifts and as the biology of the cell activates and deactivates, and it becomes, over time, the dominant sensory fact of your existence, so total and so omnipresent that you will one day, soon, if historical accounts of prisoner adaptation are accurate, stop consciously registering it, which is the olfactory equivalent of the brain's earlier reclassification of hunger and cold as background conditions rather than emergencies. The young guard exchanges buckets, avoids eye contact, and withdraws with the speed of someone who has somewhere better to be, and almost everyone has somewhere better to be than your cell, which is a fact you are increasingly aware of and which carries its own particular psychological weight. You exist in a space that even the people whose job is to manage it prefer to spend as little time in as possible. This tells you something about the space. It also tells you something about what extended residence in it does to a person. The afternoon, you believe it is afternoon, based on the angle of your light-slit indicator, brings the jailer again, this time with purpose. He stands in the doorway, which he fills with the comfortable authority of a man who has never in his professional life been required to apologize for occupying space, and he asks you a question. The question is, in its essentials, an inquiry into your resources. Do you have money? Do you have family who might send money? Do you have anything of value? Is there anyone who knows you are here and might be motivated to pay for your improved treatment? This is the intake interview, delayed by roughly 24 hours, conducted with no bureaucratic apparatus and no paperwork, as a straightforward commercial transaction. He is not cruel about it. He is not warm about it. He is the same as he was when he looked at you from the doorway this morning, professional, assessing, running the calculation of your value against the cost of your maintenance. What you tell him and how you tell it will shape the next portion of your imprisonment more than almost anything else. If you have resources or connections and you disclose them carefully, not all at once, with enough held back to maintain negotiating position, you can begin improving your conditions almost immediately. If you have nothing to offer, and you say so convincingly, the jailer files you under minimum maintenance, monitor for developments, and moves on. If you lie about your resources, you are setting up a future negotiation that will not go well for you when the lie becomes apparent. He waits for your answer with the patience of someone who has had this conversation many times and found that the truth eventually surfaces regardless, so there is no particular urgency about extracting it today. He has other cells to check, other prisoners to assess, other entries in the ledger of dungeon economics to balance. You are one item in an ongoing calculation, and the calculation will continue whether you cooperate with it or not. You tell him what you can afford to tell him. He listens. He nods, that same single professional nod. He says something. A few words that constitute neither a promise nor a threat, but something in the middle. An acknowledgement that the negotiation has begun and that its terms are understood by both parties. And then he goes and the door closes, and you are alone again with the rats and the drip and the darkness and the particular quality of silence that the dungeon specializes in. But you are less alone than you were yesterday. You know the shape of the system now. You know who holds the power and what they want and what the currency is and how the exchange functions. You have a map of sorts. It is a map of a very small, very dark, very cold territory, and every route on it leads somewhere unpleasant. But it is a map, and a map is better than nothing. In the dungeon, Better than nothing is what passes for good news. Something is happening to your body, and it is happening quietly enough that you might miss it if you weren't paying attention, which is exactly how the dungeon prefers to operate. Not in dramatic gestures, but in slow, cumulative, unremarkable increments, each one minor enough to rationalize away. All of them together building towards something you cannot rationalize at all. You have been here, you count the blade of light across the floor, your only reliable clock. Approximately 3 days now. 3 days of bread and pottage and compromised water. 3 days of stone floors and damp air and the specific cold that lives underground like a permanent resident with nowhere else to go. 3 days of the lice and the rats and the drip and the dark, and your body, which is a remarkable machine designed for considerably better conditions than these, is beginning to file its formal complaints. The first thing you notice is the cough. It arrived yesterday as a tickle, the kind you'd dismiss above ground as the early stage of a minor cold, something a good night's sleep and a hot drink would dispatch without drama. Down here, there is no good night's sleep and there is no hot drink, and the tickle has developed overnight into something more established, more resident, a cough with opinions about your lower respiratory system that it intends to share regularly throughout the day and night. This is not surprising. The air in your cell is a remarkable delivery system for everything your lungs should not be breathing, mold spores in quantities that would alarm an environmental health inspector, particulate matter from the stone itself as it slowly weathers, animal dander and worse from your rodent companions, and a general dampness that keeps the mucous membranes of your respiratory tract in a state of permanent low-grade inflammation. Your lungs are doing their best. Their best, under current conditions, is not great. The second complaint arrives from your skin. You have not washed since before your arrest, washing in the dungeon being another of those services theoretically available for a fee but practically available almost never. And your skin has begun responding to this situation with a combination of reactions that you can feel but not clearly see. In the available light, the lice have been feeding with the focused enthusiasm of creatures who have found an unusually good food source, and the bites, dozens of them, scattered across your scalp, your neck, the waistband of your clothing, have progressed from individual itching points to a diffuse, whole-body sensitization that makes your skin feel simultaneously too tight and too present, like a garment that doesn't fit properly and that you cannot remove. Some of the bites have been scratched in the night, you were not aware of scratching them, but the evidence is clear enough, and scratched bites in this environment are an invitation to infection that the environment accepts with enthusiasm. Let's talk about infection, because infection is the dungeon's most reliable and most democratic killer, applied without prejudice to prisoners of all backgrounds and social standings. The medieval world had no antibiotics. This is a fact so consequential that it is difficult to fully absorb from the perspective of a 21st century person, for whom bacterial infection is, in most cases, a temporary inconvenience resolved by a short course of medication. In the medieval dungeon, a wound that became infected, and in the dungeon, every wound became infected, because the environment was so comprehensively contaminated that the question was not whether infection would occur, but only which organisms would get there first, was the beginning of a process that had a range of possible outcomes, all of them unpleasant, some of them fatal. The mainstream historical fact for this section is both illuminating and grim. Studies of skeletal remains from medieval prison sites, combined with analysis of contemporary medical and legal records, suggest that mortality rates in medieval dungeons were extraordinarily high by any modern standard. Estimates vary widely depending on the era, the institution, and the population studied, but figures suggesting that 20 to 30% of prisoners who entered certain medieval dungeons did not leave them alive are not uncommon in the historical literature. Cause of death, where it can be determined, clusters around a predictable set of conditions. Respiratory illness, gastrointestinal disease from contaminated food and water, untreated wound infection, and the compounding cascade of effects that follows severe and sustained nutritional deficiency. These were not exotic causes. They were the ordinary biological consequences of placing human beings in cold, damp, unsanitary spaces and feeding them inadequately. Your scratched lice bites are, right now, a minor issue in this larger landscape of biological risk. But the dungeon operates on timelines longer than you are currently thinking about, and the minor issue of today has a tendency to become the moderate issue of next week and the significant problem of the week after, compounding with each iteration because your body's ability to fight infection is itself declining as your nutrition declines, your sleep deprivation accumulates, and your stress hormones, which are immunosuppressive in sustained high doses, a fact that evolution did not anticipate because sustained stress of this duration and intensity was not part of the ancestral environment, continue their quiet work of dismantling your defenses from the inside. The cold deserves serious attention here, because cold in the dungeon is not simply uncomfortable, it is physiologically active. Your body maintains its core temperature through a combination of metabolic heat generation and behavioral thermoregulation, and in the dungeon, both of these systems are under stress. Your metabolism is running on a caloric deficit, which means the furnace is being asked to maintain its output with less fuel than it requires. Your behavioral options, moving around, seeking warmth, adding layers, are constrained by the size of your cell, the absence of anything to add as layers, and the simple geometry of having nowhere to go. Your body, in response, is doing what bodies do when they cannot maintain adequate core temperature. Shunting blood away from the extremities toward the vital organs, letting your fingers and toes and ears run cold to protect your heart and lungs and brain. This is sensible triage. It is also the beginning of a process that, sustained long enough, creates its own problems. Peripheral circulation so compromised that the skin of the extremities becomes vulnerable in new ways, less able to heal minor injuries, less able to resist the fungal and bacterial opportunists that the dungeon's environment provides in abundance. Your feet are the canary in this particular coal mine. You cannot see them clearly in the available light, but you can feel them, or rather, you are beginning to have trouble feeling them, a numbness that comes and goes with the temperature fluctuations of the cell. What is happening to the skin of your feet, inside shoes that have not been removed since your arrest, in a damp environment with compromised circulation, is a process that medieval soldiers knew well from campaign conditions and called by various names in various languages, and that modern medicine calls trench foot or immersion foot syndrome. The skin softens. Then it begins to break down. Then the breaks in the skin become points of entry for everything the dungeon floor has to offer microbiologically, which is considerable. The quirky tidbit that belongs here concerns medieval dungeon medicine, which is to say the medical care available to you in your current situation, which is to say essentially nothing, delivered by no one on no schedule. Formally. Informally, however, there existed within the dungeon ecosystem a body of practical knowledge about managing illness and injury that was transmitted between prisoners and between dungeon populations over generations, a folk medicine of incarceration that was empirically derived, inconsistently effective, and often the only thing standing between a prisoner and a condition that could not be survived without intervention. Prisoners learned which molds helped with infected wounds, smearing them directly on the injury, a practice now understood as a primitive topical antibiotic application. They learned that certain mosses growing on the dungeon walls had astringent properties useful for slowing bleeding. They learned that the rats, unpleasant as they were as neighbors, were less unpleasant as supplementary protein, and that eating them, despite the obvious concerns, extended life more reliably than not eating them. This body of dungeon knowledge was never written down, never formalized, never acknowledged by the authorities who ran these places. It existed entirely in the oral tradition of people who had every reason to pay very close attention to what worked and what didn't, because the stakes of getting it wrong were as high as stakes get. Your cough worsens through the day. By the afternoon, blade of light across the floor, moving toward the base of the right wall. It has acquired a productive quality, which in medical terminology means it is bringing things up, things from your lower respiratory tract that your body has correctly identified as not belonging there and is attempting to expel, and which you are expelling into the corner of your cell because there is nowhere else for them to go. This is the dungeon's entry point for pulmonary infection. The contaminated air, the weakened defenses, the inability to rest properly, all converging on a respiratory system that is working overtime to maintain function in an environment it was not designed for. Medieval physicians, had one been available, which one is not, because physicians did not make dungeon calls in the ordinary course of events, would have diagnosed your condition through the system of humoral medicine, the framework inherited from ancient Greek medicine that understood the body as a balance of 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Respiratory illness of the productive type would have been understood as an excess of phlegm, cold and wet, appropriate enough given the environment, and the treatment would have involved warming and drying agents, hot drinks, certain herbs, perhaps a change of environment. The diagnosis, in retrospect, was not entirely wrong. Cold and wet were indeed implicated in your condition, But the treatment options were all unavailable to you regardless of their merit, so the theoretical accuracy of the humoral framework is of limited comfort. What you have instead of treatment is time. Time and the body's own resilience, which is considerable, which is the reason humanity survived the medieval period at all given the conditions it routinely imposed on itself. The human immune system, operating under these conditions, is mounting responses you cannot feel and would not recognize even if you could. Cellular responses, inflammatory responses, the complex orchestration of the body's defense infrastructure. And it is doing so on insufficient fuel with insufficient rest support, which means it is doing so less effectively than it could but not without effort. Your body wants to survive this. That instinct, wired deeper than thought, is one of the few reliable allies you have in here. Gastrointestinal distress arrived on day 2 and has settled in as a permanent feature of your new normal. The water, as anticipated, had things in it that your modern gut flora was not prepared to negotiate with, and the negotiations have been ongoing and uncomfortable since approximately the second morning. Medieval prisoners routinely dealt with dysentery, caused by contaminated water and food, catastrophically common in confined spaces with poor sanitation, and dysentery in the dungeon context was not simply miserable but dangerous, because it accelerated dehydration in an environment where adequate hydration was already nearly impossible, and because the additional sanitation burden it created worsened the cell environment in ways that compounded every other biological risk already present. You have not yet reached full dysentery. Your symptoms are currently in the range of persistent discomfort rather than acute crisis, but the direction of travel is clear, and the bucket in the corner of your cell is becoming increasingly central to your existence in ways you would prefer not to dwell on. The rats have noticed the change in your cell's microbiological character. They are attentive creatures, responsive to environmental information, and whatever information your cell is currently broadcasting, they have received it and updated their behavioral patterns accordingly. They are more active than they were on the first night, more of them visible in the dimness, more confident in their approach to your territory, less inclined to maintain the respectful distance of that first evening's assessment. This is a development that requires management because rats in medieval dungeons did not merely create psychological distress. They were vectors for disease, most notably the bubonic plague, though the flea-to-human transmission mechanism for plague was not understood at the time, and also for leptospirosis, toxoplasmosis, and a range of other zoonotic diseases that your modern medical training, such as it is, gives you more vocabulary for than capacity to address. Historians still argue whether the extraordinary mortality of the Black Death in the mid-14th century was significantly amplified by the dungeon system, the idea being that prisons and dungeons, with their dense rat populations and their constrained human populations in close contact with those rats, served as amplification nodes for the plague pathogen, seeding it into the human population through prisoner releases and guard movements in ways that accelerated its spread. The evidence is indirect and the epidemiology is complex, but the argument has enough traction in the historical and epidemiological literature to be taken seriously. By the end of your third day, you have conducted an inventory of your body's condition with the thoroughness of someone who has nothing else to do and everything to lose. The cough, the gut situation, the skin issues, the feet, the persistent, all-body ache that you initially attributed to sleeping on stone but which has now been present long enough to raise questions about whether something more systemic is happening. The headache that has been sitting at the base of your skull since the morning of day 2, not dramatic enough to dominate your attention but persistent enough to color everything else. The fatigue that is not the clean fatigue of physical exertion but the gray, directionless fatigue of sustained biological stress, the kind that rest does not fully address because rest is not fully available. You are not dying. You want to be clear with yourself about this. You are not dying, you are adapting, your body is running its protocols, the situation is difficult but not yet critical. This self-assessment is both accurate and an act of psychological will, the kind of will that everyone who has survived extended imprisonment, and people have survived it for months and years in conditions no better than yours, has had to cultivate. The body's rebellion is real and it is ongoing, but it is not yet winning. The dungeon, patient as always, is not concerned about timelines. It has seen this before. It will see it again. It simply continues to be what it is, cold, damp, dark, alive with things that want to eat your food and your blood and your tissue in roughly that order, and it waits, with geological indifference, for the biological story playing out inside you to reach its next chapter. You pull your knees to your chest. You cough. You wait for the blade of light to tell you that another day has turned. Outside, somewhere above all the stone and silence, the world continues its business. There is a specific hour, you have identified it now, after enough days to recognize the pattern, when the dungeon achieves its most complete silence. Not the relative silence of the small hours, when the castle above has merely quieted, but a deeper silence, a silence with mass and temperature, that arrives somewhere in the middle of the night and sits in your cell like a presence. In this silence, you can hear your own heartbeat. You can hear the sound of your own breathing, which has acquired a slight roughness from the cough, a new texture in the audio of your own body that is both informative and unsettling. You can hear the rats moving, though they too seem subdued by the silence, operating at reduced volume as if they understand that this hour belongs to something older and quieter than any of the dungeon's usual residents. It is in this hour that your mind does its most interesting and most dangerous work. You have been here long enough now. The light blade count puts it somewhere between 1 and 2 weeks, though your confidence in the count has been eroding as the days have become harder to distinguish from each other, that the acute phase of your imprisonment has settled into something more chronic. The initial shock has metabolized. The body's emergency responses have downgraded to maintenance mode. What remains, stripped of the drama of arrival and the urgency of the first days, is the sustained, structural experience of a human mind placed in conditions specifically hostile to its functioning. And what that mind does in response is one of the most carefully observed and least comfortable stories in the history of human psychology. The darkness is the beginning of it. Not darkness as metaphor, the actual physical darkness of your cell, which you have been inhabiting for enough hours now to have developed a relationship with it that goes beyond simple deprivation. Human beings are not equipped for extended darkness. The visual system, deprived of light, does not simply turn off and wait patiently for illumination to return, keeps working, keeps sending signals. And in the absence of actual visual information to process, it begins with the creative desperation of a system that cannot accept inactivity to generate its own. You have been seeing things in the dark that are not there. You are aware that they are not there. This awareness does not stop them from appearing. It begins subtly, shapes in the peripheral vision that resolve to nothing when you turn toward them, a movement in the corner that turns out to be the wall, exactly where it has always been. These early visual confabulations are the normal output of a visual cortex running on insufficient input, the brain's equivalent of a radio picking up static when no signal is available. They are not hallucinations in the clinical sense, not yet. But they are the beginning of a continuum that, with sufficient time and sufficient deprivation, leads somewhere significantly more disorienting, and the medieval dungeon was, whether its architects understood this or not, extremely well designed for moving people along that continuum. The mainstream historical fact for this section is both surprising and, once understood, completely logical. Medieval captors and dungeon administrators, working without any formal psychological framework, without the vocabulary of sensory deprivation or dissociation or learned helplessness, intuitively understood that the architecture of the dungeon, the darkness, the silence, the isolation, the removal of time cues and social reference points, was a tool of psychological pressure at least as powerful as any physical instrument in the interrogation room. Documents from the period do not use the language of psychology, but they describe outcomes in terms that modern psychologists recognize immediately: prisoners who emerge from extended solo confinement disoriented, compliant, unable to maintain consistent narratives, prone to confabulation, suggestible in ways they were not before. The dungeon was a psychological instrument before anyone had the word psychological. The removal of time is perhaps the most insidious component of this. Human beings are chronobiological creatures. Our bodies, our hormones, our cognitive function, our emotional regulation are all deeply synchronized to the cycle of day and night, the rhythm of light and dark, the predictable architecture of time that we use to organize experience. Strip that architecture away, as the dungeon does with methodical completeness, and the organizing structure of consciousness begins to loosen. Your days have already become ambiguous. You know this, you have felt the edges of the days blurring into each other, the difficulty of maintaining a clear sense of sequence. You know that things have happened in a particular order, but the emotional weight of recent events is no longer reliably correlated with their recency, which means your internal timeline is drifting, detaching from the external timeline in ways that are difficult to articulate and impossible to correct without access to the external reference points that would allow correction. Sleep is the time mechanism most immediately affected. Your sleep has, since the first night, been fragmented, interrupted by the cold, the stone, the cough, the rats, the drip, the random sounds of the dungeon's nocturnal life. But fragmented sleep is not simply uncomfortable. It is cognitively and emotionally destabilizing in ways that accumulate across days with compound interest. Sleep deprivation at the level you are experiencing, not total deprivation but chronic, severe fragmentation, impairs memory consolidation, which means the experiences of each day are not being properly integrated into long-term memory the way they should be, creating a sense of events happening in a kind of fog. It impairs emotional regulation, which means that feelings arrive with disproportionate intensity and depart without leaving the residue of processed experience. It impairs the prefrontal cortex's executive functions, the cognitive machinery of planning, perspective-taking, rational decision-making, which means the part of your brain best equipped to manage your current situation is running at reduced capacity precisely when you need it most. Historians still argue whether sleep deprivation in medieval dungeons was deliberately engineered or simply an unavoidable byproduct of the conditions. The argument centers on certain documented practices: midnight guard changes conducted noisily, the timing of food deliveries at irregular hours, the placement of particularly loud or active prisoners adjacent to cells where specific individuals were being held. That could be interpreted as intentional disruption, or could be interpreted as the ordinary inefficiency of a medieval institution that simply did not think carefully about prisoner sleep schedules. The effect was the same regardless of intent, and the effect was considerable. What isolation does to the mind over time is something that modern psychology has documented with uncomfortable precision through studies of solitary confinement, sensory deprivation experiments, and the accounts of people who have experienced extended periods of isolation involuntarily. The process follows a pattern. In the first phase, which you are now leaving, the mind is preoccupied with the external situation, the physical conditions, the food, the sounds, the immediate practicalities of survival. This phase is awful, but it is outward-facing, engaged with the world, even if the world has shrunk to the dimensions of a stone cell. In the second phase, which you are entering, the mind turns inward, and the inward landscape becomes the primary territory to be navigated. Memories surface with unusual vividness and unusual randomness. Not the memories you would choose to revisit, but the ones your subconscious selects. Often the charged ones, the unresolved ones, the ones you spent considerable energy not thinking about above ground. They arrive with a clarity and a presence that is almost hallucinatory. These memories, filling the dark cell with the vivid textures of another life. This is not entirely comfortable, as you are discovering. The life you remember from above ground contains, as all lives do, its full complement of regret and loss and missed opportunity and relationships that ended badly and choices that look different in retrospect, and down here in the dark with no external input competing for your attention. These memories are not the passing thoughts they were above ground. They are immersive, consuming, present in the way that the stone walls are present, inescapable and solid. Your mind, deprived of new experiences to process, is processing old ones with a thoroughness and intensity that would strike anyone observing from outside as productive self-reflection, but which feels, from inside, much more like being slowly taken apart. The quirky tidbit for this section exists at the intersection of medieval theology and medieval psychology, two fields that in this period were barely distinguishable from each other. Medieval Christian theology had a concept called aesthesia, sometimes translated as sloth but actually describing something considerably more specific and more interesting, a spiritual condition of torpor, numbness, and an inability to engage with meaningful activity or with God, characterized by a quality of gray, motivationless emptiness that the medieval theologians understood as spiritually dangerous. Monks were warned about aesthesia, particularly in the context of solitary contemplative practice, where the absence of social interaction and structured activity created conditions in which aesthesia could take hold. The symptoms described in medieval theological literature, the inability to concentrate, the distortion of time perception, the oscillation between agitation and paralysis, the intrusive thoughts, the sense of meaninglessness, map with startling precision onto the symptoms of what modern psychology calls depression and what modern clinical literature identifies as a predictable outcome of extended isolation. The medieval theologians diagnosed this as a spiritual crisis and prescribed prayer and physical labor as treatment. The modern psychologist diagnoses it as a psychiatric crisis and prescribes social reconnection and structured activity. The prescription is, in both cases, essentially the same. You need other people and you need purpose, and the dungeon, with systematic efficiency, has removed both. You have been talking to yourself. You notice this with a clarity that cuts through the general fog, the awareness that you have been holding conversations, sometimes muttering aloud, sometimes conducting the whole exchange internally but with a vividness and a dialogic quality that is distinct from ordinary thinking. You have been talking to people who are not present. Your family, perhaps, or friends, or enemies, or some composite figure assembled by your subconscious from the materials available. This is not, at this stage, a sign of serious mental deterioration. It is a completely understandable and well-documented response to social isolation, the mind manufacturing the social contact it is being denied because social contact is not a luxury for human beings but a biological necessity, as fundamental as food or water, and the mind will produce a simulacrum of it rather than go entirely without. But the simulacrum has edges. The conversations you are having with absent people are conducted on your terms, with your version of those people, and your version has access only to what you knew about them before your arrest, supplemented by what your imagination has constructed in the interim. They cannot surprise you. They cannot tell you anything new. They cannot provide the specific nourishment of actual human contact, the thing that makes real interaction irreplaceable, the genuine otherness of another consciousness, the friction of encountering a mind that is not your own. Your imaginary companions are, when examined closely, mirrors. They reflect you back to yourself with variations, and after enough time, this becomes its own kind of trap, a recursive loop that turns inward and inward without ever reaching anything outside itself. The physical darkness and the psychological darkness are beginning to feel like the same phenomenon. This is one of the more disorienting developments of the second week, and it is one that you have no framework for, because in the world above ground, where light reliably appears and disappears on schedule and social contact is continuous and the sensory world is rich and varied and renewing, the distinction between external and internal experience is maintained effortlessly, automatically, as a basic orienting function of consciousness. Down here, where the external world has been reduced to a handful of unchanging sensory inputs, that distinction requires active maintenance, and active maintenance requires cognitive resources that are being drained faster than they can be replenished. You are not losing your mind. You want to be precise about this, for the same reasons you wanted to be precise about not dying. Precision itself is a form of resistance, the application of clear thinking to the situation, a declaration that the thinking is still clear. You are experiencing the predictable, documented, survivable psychological effects of conditions that are objectively hostile to psychological health. These effects are real, they are consequential, they will leave marks that remain after the dungeon does, but they are not yet, not if certain things remain stable, the permanent demolition of the person you were when you arrived. What the dungeon understands, at a structural level, is something that its medieval operators intuited without theorizing. That a person who has been sufficiently destabilized psychologically is more manageable than a person who has not. The compliance that extended isolation produces is not simply a matter of broken will. It is a matter of broken epistemology, a state in which the prisoner's ability to evaluate their own situation, to maintain consistent beliefs and preferences and plans, has been compromised enough that they become easier to move, to persuade, to redirect, to obtain information from, or signatures from, or recantations from, or confessions from. The dungeon is, in this reading, not merely a place of punishment or containment but a processing environment, designed, whether deliberately or by accumulated institutional wisdom, to produce a particular kind of person at the output end. A softer person, a more pliable person, a person who, when the door finally opens and someone with authority steps through it and asks them something, finds that the certainties they arrived with have developed an unexpected flexibility. The silence of the deepest hour presses around you. You are thinking about light, not the thin blade of light from the slit window which is your daily ration, but light as a concept, light as a quality of existence, the specific texture of afternoon sunlight on skin, the way it feels across your face, the warmth of it, the information it carries about the time of day and the season and your place in the physical world. You can recall this with extraordinary vividness. The dungeon has sharpened your memory for sensory experience even as it has blurred your memory for sequence and time, the deprivation of sensation making each remembered sensation hyper-real, preserved in the mind with the obsessive clarity of something irreplaceable. You hold the memory of sunlight the way you might hold something warm in your hands. Outside, it is whatever time it is, whatever weather it is, whatever season the world has moved into while you have been underground counting light on a stone floor. The darkness continues. Your heart continues. The drip continues, faithful as a metronome, marking time for a concert no one has chosen to attend. The door opens differently this time. You have become, through necessity, an expert in the acoustics of your cell door, its moods, its variations, the information carried in the specific quality of each opening. The routine opening has a casual quality to it, the lock turned with the practiced efficiency of someone doing a familiar task while thinking about something else. The jailer's opening has a deliberateness to it, a measured quality that signals assessment rather than action. This opening is different from both. This opening has a quality of purpose to it, a mechanical certainty that communicates itself through the stone and the silence before the door has finished moving, before the light from the corridor has fully entered the cell, before you have processed what you are seeing in anything more than instinctual terms. There are three of them. Not the usual guard complement, these are different men, or rather they occupy their bodies differently, with a forward-leaning intentionality that the routine guards do not have. The one in front carries nothing. The two behind him carry things that you register first as shapes and then, as your eyes work through the adjustment from cell darkness to corridor torchlight, as objects with specific purposes that your mind is reluctant to name directly. You are going to the interrogation room. This moment, the transition from cell to interrogation space, is where the dungeon's two primary functions converge. The containment function and the extraction function, the keeping and the asking, meeting at a door that opens in the middle of the night with that quality of mechanical certainty. Medieval interrogation was a complex institution, more legally structured than popular imagination suggests and simultaneously more brutal than legal structure alone can account for. And understanding that complexity is important because it shaped every aspect of what is about to happen to you and what you can reasonably do about it. The first thing to understand is the legal framework, because there was one, and it mattered more than you might expect. The use of torture in medieval European judicial proceedings was not simply a free-for-all of unconstrained violence. In most medieval legal systems influenced by Roman law, which, through the rediscovery of Roman legal texts in the 12th century, came to shape judicial practice across much of continental Europe, torture was a legally regulated procedure with specific conditions for its application. It was supposed to be used only when there was already substantial evidence of guilt and only when the crime in question was serious enough to warrant it. It was supposed to be supervised by a judge or legal official. It was not supposed to produce permanent injury or death. Confessions obtained under torture were, in theory, required to be confirmed by the accused the following day, without duress, before they were considered legally valid. This is your mainstream historical fact, and it is one that sits uncomfortably alongside the actual history of medieval interrogation. The gap between the formal legal regulation of torture and its actual practice was large enough to drive a cart through, and people regularly drove carts through it. The requirement for prior evidence was loosely interpreted. The prohibition on permanent injury was applied with flexibility. The confirmation requirement was satisfied through various mechanisms that technically met the letter of the requirement while comprehensively violating its spirit. And in the dungeons of lords and kings operating outside formal judicial structures, which described a significant portion of actual medieval imprisonment, the legal framework applied even more loosely, if at all. Historians still argue whether the formal regulation of torture in medieval law represented a genuine attempt to limit its abuse, a theoretical ideal that everyone understood was rarely achieved in practice, or simply a legal face-saving exercise that provided the appearance of procedure while permitting the substance of anything the interrogator found useful. The room you are brought to is not large. It is, if anything, slightly smaller than your cell, which creates an immediate and probably intentional spatial intimacy. You cannot establish distance from anything in here, including the people and the objects. There is a torch on the wall, and the torch produces more light than you have experienced in some time, which should be welcome and instead is disorienting, the illumination too sudden and too bright after your weeks of dimness, making you squint and shade your eyes with the vulnerable reflexiveness of a creature who has adapted to the dark and is now being returned to the light with insufficient warning. There is a chair. One chair, to which you are directed with a gesture that is not quite a shove but occupies the same conceptual territory. There is a table, and on the table there are things. The things on the table are the objects the two men behind were carrying, now laid out with an arrangement that is neither random nor accidental. This arrangement is itself a technique, the display of instruments before their use, the presentation of possibility before the application of reality. Medieval interrogators understood, as all skilled practitioners of psychological pressure understand, that what a person imagines will happen to them and what actually happens to them are not always the same thing, and that the imagination, given sufficient material to work with, will sometimes do the interrogator's work for them. Let us talk about what is on the table, because euphemism does not serve anyone in this section. The instruments of medieval interrogation were not the elaborate mechanical contraptions of popular imagination, the Iron Maiden, the rack, the various improbable devices that fill the torture chambers of tourist attractions across Europe, many of which are either later inventions or outright fabrications assembled in the 18th and 19th centuries to satisfy the Gothic appetites of a public that wanted medieval cruelty to be dramatic and architecturally impressive. The actual instruments were often simpler, more portable, and in their simplicity more revealing of a sophisticated understanding of human pain thresholds and psychological breaking points. What you see on the table includes rope, specifically configured rope, the configuration carrying information about its intended use that you read with the animal part of your brain faster than the analytical part can process it. There are metal implements, small enough to be handheld, whose function you can infer from their form. There is a brazier in the corner, not yet fully lit, its purpose currently thermal rather than anything else, though the anything else is visible in the collection of metal objects resting in it, waiting for the heat that will change their state from inert to active. There are wedges, wooden wedges of various sizes, smooth with use, worn in specific places in ways that indicate the forces that have been applied to them and the resistances those forces have met. The quirky tidbit for this section is the strappato, which was simultaneously one of the most widely used interrogation techniques in medieval and early modern Europe and one of the most elegant in its terrible simplicity. The strappato involved binding the subject's hands behind their back, attaching a rope to the bound wrists, and hoisting the subject off the ground by that rope, so that the entire body weight hung from the shoulder joints in a direction those joints were not designed to accommodate. The position was excruciating. Held long enough, it produced dislocation of the shoulders, which was both agonizing and permanent. The technique's elegance, from the interrogator's perspective, was its scalability. Weights could be added to the subject's feet to increase the effect, the height could be varied, the duration could be calibrated, and the whole procedure could be interrupted and resumed with minimal setup. It required no elaborate machinery, only a rope and an anchor point, which meant it was deployable anywhere and by anyone. The Inquisition used it extensively. Secular courts used it. It appears in records from England, France, Italy, Germany, and the Iberian Peninsula, which tells you something about how the information about effective interrogation techniques traveled across medieval Europe despite the absence of any formal professional network for sharing such information. The man in front, the one who carries nothing, which you now understand means he is the one with the authority, the one who asks the questions, sits on a stool that has been placed on the opposite side of the table from you. He has a document. The document is not something you can read from where you sit, but it is real, it is written on parchment, and it is handled with the careful authority of something official. This is the charge document or something functioning as one, the formal articulation of what you are supposed to have done and what information is now being sought about it. He begins to speak. Medieval interrogation, when it followed anything resembling the prescribed procedure, began with questions asked without the application of any physical pressure, a phase called territio verbalis, verbal intimidation, in the Latin legal terminology of the period. This phase had several functions. It gave the interrogator information about the subject, their composure, their intelligence, their likely breaking point, the quality of their prior preparation for this moment. It gave the subject the opportunity to confess or provide information voluntarily, which was preferred by the legal framework because voluntary confession required no verification and produced no questions about the legitimacy of the information obtained. and it established a record, however informal, that the prescribed process had been followed, that things had been done in the right order, that what followed was legally defensible. You answer the questions you can answer. You refuse the questions you cannot answer safely, or cannot answer truthfully in a way that serves your interests. Your refusals are calm. You have had enough time in the cell to think about this moment, to prepare for it in the way that people who have been given nothing to do but think prepare for the things they know are coming. The interrogator listens to your answers with the patient attention of someone who is not particularly surprised by any of them, who has heard versions of all of them before, who is taking note of not just what you say but how you say it, the pauses, the word choices, the physical tells that accompany deception or concealment in most people regardless of how carefully they attempt to suppress them. The shift from territio verbalis to what comes next is not dramatic. That is perhaps the most disorienting thing about it. You expect drama, you have braced for a clear demarcation, a moment that announces itself as the transition between two phases of the proceeding. Instead, there is a pause, a brief exchange between the interrogator and one of the other men, a gesture whose meaning you are not in a position to misinterpret, and then the rope is in play, and the table with its objects is no longer merely decorative. And the proceeding enters its second phase with a matter-of-fact efficiency that is somehow worse than drama would have been. The medieval understanding of pain as a truth-revealing mechanism was sincere, not cynical, which is in some ways more disturbing than cynicism would be. The theological and philosophical framework underlying judicial torture held that the body, under sufficient duress, could not maintain the will necessary for deliberate deception, that pain overwhelmed the rational faculty, the part capable of sustained lying, and left only the involuntary truth of physical response. This framework was wrong in ways that the evidence available at the time should have made apparent. People under torture confessed to things they did not do with the same frequency and the same apparent conviction with which they confessed to things they did. A basic empirical fact that the framework had to contort itself significantly to explain, and historians still argue whether the persistence of judicial torture despite this evident unreliability indicates that medieval legal authorities were genuinely convinced of its efficacy, or whether torture served purposes other than truth extraction, purposes of spectacle, of deterrence, of demonstrating power, that were valuable enough to continue the practice regardless of its reliability as an information-gathering tool. You are not thinking about the historical debate right now. You are thinking with the sharp, focused, present-tense clarity that physical duress produces, the mind stripped of everything non-essential, reduced to its most immediate functions, the philosophical furniture of your usual consciousness swept away and replaced by the pure priority of the present moment. This clarity is paradoxical. You have never thought more clearly in your life about fewer things, and the things you are thinking clearly about are the immediate facts of your physical situation and the question of what you can say that will change those facts. What experienced prisoners discovered, through the terrible empiricism of the interrogation room, was that the most effective posture was neither complete resistance nor complete capitulation. Complete resistance, refusing everything, providing nothing, extended the proceeding beyond what most people could sustain, and produced outcomes that were worse in the medium term than controlled disclosure. Complete capitulation, confessing to everything, providing every name and detail requested, was dangerous because it was verifiable, because the interrogator would check the information provided and the discrepancies between what was confessed and what could be verified would raise questions that required further resolution. The third path, providing information that was true but limited, useful but not devastatingly so, enough to satisfy the immediate requirement without creating the conditions for a worse follow-up, required a cognitive precision that the conditions of the interrogation room were specifically designed to undermine. The session ends. Not with resolution, with exhaustion, a resource constraint on both sides, the interrogator reaching the point where further investment of time and effort exceeds expected return, you reaching a point where coherent communication of any kind is no longer reliably available. There is a moment, brief, almost administrative, in which the transition back to your cell is arranged, and then you are moving back through the corridor, up or down some stairs, and the sound of your cell door has never contained so much information as it does when it closes behind you this time. The floor is cold. It has always been cold. Tonight, it is also the closest thing to comfort that your world contains. You lie down on it with the totality of someone who has nothing left to protect, and the darkness receives you with the patient indifference it offers everyone, and the drip resumes its metronomic commentary. And somewhere outside this stone and these walls the knight is doing whatever knights do when no one in a dungeon is watching. You have survived the interrogation room. What that survival costs and what it changes is a calculation you will begin making tomorrow. The morning after the interrogation room arrives like all mornings arrive down here, not with light but with the gradual acoustic evidence of the castle resuming its operations above you, that geological rumor of footsteps and movement transmitted through stone. The dungeon's version of a dawn chorus. You are awake before it, if awake is the right word for the state you have been in since they returned you to your cell. A state of horizontal consciousness, lying on the stone with your eyes open in the dark, cataloging your body's condition with the detached thoroughness of someone who has learned to treat physical assessment as a cognitive task, something to do, something that imposes structure on the formless hours. The assessment is not encouraging, but it is not the assessment that matters most this morning. What matters most is that the interrogation room did not resolve your situation. It complicated it. You are not, as far as you can determine, scheduled for immediate execution. You are not, as far as you can determine, being released. You exist in the ambiguous middle territory that the medieval dungeon specialized in, a state of unresolved process, your fate pending the outcome of deliberations happening entirely above your pay grade, in rooms you will never see, between people whose names you may not know, based on considerations that may have less to do with what you said in that room last night than with the shifting political landscape of a world that has been continuing without you while you counted light on a stone floor. This ambiguity is the context in which the question of getting out becomes not merely a fantasy but a practical project. Something to think about with the careful, methodical attention of a person who has time and motivation in equal and abundant measure. So let us think about it together. Let us lay out, with the honest pragmatism that your situation demands, the actual options available to a medieval prisoner who wants to leave the dungeon alive, because there are more of them than popular imagination suggests and fewer of them than hope would prefer. The first and most reliable exit route was ransom, and ransom was not simply a medieval quirk, but a sophisticated financial and diplomatic instrument that shaped the entire culture of medieval warfare and imprisonment. The system worked, in its essential form, like this. A prisoner of sufficient social or political value was held not to be punished but to be exchanged for money, and the money, once paid, secured release as reliably as any legal judgment. The ransom system was so deeply embedded in medieval aristocratic culture that it functioned almost as a gentleman's agreement. One with teeth, one backed by the threat of indefinite imprisonment or worse, but an agreement nonetheless, with recognized procedures and recognizable good faith on both sides. Knights captured in battle expected to be ransomed. Lords expected to ransom their captured knights. The amounts were calibrated to what the prisoner's family or lord could reasonably be expected to produce, and the negotiation of that amount was conducted through intermediaries with the careful formality of a commercial transaction, because that is precisely what it was. The mainstream historical fact for this section involves the most famous ransom in medieval European history, the 150,000 marks demanded for Richard I of England, captured by Duke Leopold of Austria in 1192 while returning from the Third Crusade. This sum represented approximately 2 to 3 times the annual revenue of the English crown, and raising it required the implementation of a kingdom-wide tax, literally called the ransom tax, that fell on every segment of English society from the great lords to the village peasants, assessed at a quarter of each person's annual income. The operation of raising this ransom, coordinating it, collecting it, and transporting it to its destination while managing the political complexities of a kingdom whose king had been absent and then imprisoned for years, represents one of the more extraordinary administrative achievements of the medieval period. Richard was released in 1194, having spent just under 14 months in captivity. He reportedly said, upon release, something to the effect that he had been sold like a beast, which is a sentiment that resonates considerably more vividly from your current position than it might from an armchair. You do not have a kingdom to tax for your ransom. But the principle scales down through the social hierarchy. Merchants had guilds and trading partners who might contribute, minor landowners had tenants and family networks, even relatively humble prisoners sometimes had communities who could collectively scrape together the required sum. The question of who knew you were here and what they might be willing and able to do about it was the first calculation any imprisoned person made, and the making of that calculation was itself a form of hope, a way of projecting forward into a future in which the situation had changed. The second exit route was legal, formal judicial process resulting in acquittal, or the completion of a sentence, or the determination that the grounds for imprisonment were insufficient. This route was slower, less reliable, and more dependent on factors outside your control than ransom, but it existed and it occasionally worked. Medieval legal systems, chaotic and inconsistent as they were, did produce acquittals. They did result in releases. The problem was the timeline, which was governed not by any principle of swift justice but by the administrative convenience of the court, the availability of witnesses, the political climate surrounding your case, and the simple logistical reality of a legal system operating without the communication infrastructure necessary to move cases forward at any reliable pace. Prisoners waited. They waited months for a hearing date that did not come, years for a case that kept being deferred, indefinitely for a resolution that kept receding as circumstances changed. The dungeon's population included people who had been waiting for legal resolution for so long that the resolution, when it eventually came, found them barely capable of engaging with it. Bribery occupied a third category, related to but distinct from both ransom and legal process. Where ransom was a formal negotiation at the level of the prisoner's social superiors, bribery operated at the level of the dungeon's internal economy. The jailer, the guards, the administrative figures who controlled access and movement. A sufficiently generous payment to the right person could produce a remarkable range of outcomes: reduced security, access to materials not officially permitted, advance warning of developments in your case, messages carried out of the dungeon to people who could act on them, and in the most extreme cases, the simple looking away that allowed a prisoner to leave through a door that happened to be unlocked at a time when a particular guard happened to be elsewhere. Bribery as a prison exit strategy was constrained by two factors. The first was resources. Bribery requires currency, and currency in a medieval dungeon was scarce, difficult to acquire, and impossible to replenish from inside the cell. Prisoners who entered with money, hidden on their person, not discovered during the admittedly inconsistent search procedure of medieval intake, had a resource to spend. Those who entered without had to find other currencies. Information, social connection, the promise of future payment, whatever skills or knowledge they possessed that someone in the dungeon's chain of command might find valuable. The second constraint was trust, or rather its absence. A guard who accepted a bribe to look away could, if the bribe was insufficient or if the political consequences of the prisoner's escape seemed to outweigh the payment, simply pocket the money and not look away, or worse, report the bribery attempt as a way of demonstrating loyalty upward in the hierarchy. The prisoner had no recourse. The dungeon's power structure did not include any mechanism for enforcing agreements with people who were not supposed to know you were trying to escape. The quirky historical tidbit for this section is the escape of Roger Mortimer from the Tower of London in 1323, which represents a masterclass in the combination of bribery, social engineering, and opportunistic timing that characterized the most successful medieval prison breaks. Mortimer, imprisoned by Edward II and awaiting likely execution, organized his escape through a combination of cultivated relationships with sympathetic guards, the strategic use of drugged wine administered to the constable and other senior staff during a feast held in the tower, and a prearranged rope lowered from an external wall by Confederates waiting outside. The operation required coordination between inside the tower and outside it, maintained across a period of months during which Mortimer was under close confinement and communication with the outside world was supposed to be impossible. He escaped, fled to France, eventually returned to England as the lover and political partner of Queen Isabella, deposed and arranged the murder of Edward II, and governed England as regent for several years. The escape, in retrospect, was the beginning of one of the most dramatic political reversals in English medieval history, which suggests that keeping Mortimer locked up was considerably more important than anyone managing his imprisonment fully appreciated. You do not have Roger Mortimer's political connections or his particular genius for organizing complex operations from inside a stone box. But you have been thinking, with the focused attention of someone who has had weeks to think about very little else, about what resources you actually possess and how those resources might be applied to the problem of not being here anymore. The jailer is the key, not literally, though he does have the literal key, but in the strategic sense. Everything in the dungeon's economy passes through the jailer. He is the node, the bottleneck, the single point through which all flows of information and resource and access must travel. A prisoner who can offer the jailer something he wants, something he cannot easily obtain through other means, something valuable enough to outweigh the professional risk of cooperation, has a lever, and levers in constrained systems can move things that seem immovable. The question is what you have that he wants, and the answer to that question requires knowing more about him than he has chosen to reveal, which requires the kind of sustained, careful observation that your current situation does not make easy, but that your current situation makes absolutely necessary. The royal pardon was a fourth exit route, and one that operated at the highest level of the political system. Medieval monarchs maintained the power of pardon, the prerogative of clemency, the royal ability to override judicial determination and simply declare that a prisoner was to be released. This power was real and it was exercised, though its exercise was governed by political logic rather than humanitarian impulse. Pardons were granted when releasing a prisoner served the king's interests. As a political gesture toward a powerful family, as part of a diplomatic settlement, as a reward for service rendered or promised, as a response to the intercession of someone whose goodwill the king valued. The path to a royal pardon ran through the network of people with access to the king, which meant it ran through every relationship you had ever cultivated above ground, and whether any of those relationships extended far enough up the social hierarchy to reach someone with genuine influence. Prayer was the fifth route, and the one that required the least material resource and offered the least material guarantee. The medieval prisoner prayed. This is documented so consistently across the historical record that it requires no argument. And the prayer was not merely an expression of spiritual feeling but a form of active petition, addressed to God, to the Virgin, to whichever saint's intercession seemed most applicable to the specific situation. Saints with particular relevance to prisoners included Saint Leonard of Noblac, the patron saint of prisoners, whose cult was widespread across medieval Europe and whose intercession was credited in numerous accounts with miraculous releases and deliverances. The historical record contains many such accounts. Prisoners suddenly freed through no apparent human agency, chains falling away, doors opening without keys, which the medieval mind attributed to divine intercession and the modern historian attributes to the complex of social and political factors that actually produced the release, with the timing coinciding with the prayer often enough to maintain the theological framework for both parties. Your most immediate practical resource is information. You know things about your case, about the people involved in it, about the world above ground, that have value to someone or potentially to several someones. The interrogation session established some of what the people running this operation want to know, and the overlap between what they want and what you know is your primary negotiating material. The art is in the calibration. Revealing enough to demonstrate that you have something worth paying for, without revealing enough that the payment is rendered unnecessary by the disclosure. This is a negotiation conducted entirely on the other party's terms, in their facility, with their tools, and the asymmetry of it is not something you can eliminate, only work within. And then there is the option that popular imagination most associates with medieval imprisonment and that the historical record suggests was the least common successful exit: physical escape. Actual physical escape from a medieval dungeon, of the tunneling through walls or filing through bars variety, was rare not because prisoners didn't attempt it but because the physics of the situation worked comprehensively against it. The walls of a stone dungeon cell, mortared medieval construction, were typically between 1 and 3 meters thick. The door was iron-reinforced oak, locked with a mechanism requiring the specific key, and checked at irregular intervals precisely to discourage confidence about when the next check would occur. The window slit, your thin blade of light, was too narrow to pass a human body through by design, the design being specifically to admit light and air while excluding the human body, a function it performed competently. What made escape possible in the cases where it succeeded was almost never brute force. It was the human element, the specific vulnerabilities of the people managing the system, the gaps and lapses and moments of distraction and cupidity and sympathy that no institutional system can entirely eliminate because institutional systems are run by human beings, and human beings are inconsistent, corruptible, and occasionally moved by things that have nothing to do with their professional responsibilities. You file this understanding away alongside the assessment of the jailer, the accounting of your resources, the mapping of the relationships in the dungeon's hierarchy. You are building something up here in the weeks since your arrival. Not a plan, not yet, because a plan requires information you don't yet have and conditions you can't yet verify. But the architecture of a plan. the skeleton of a possibility. The beginning of a forward-facing orientation that the dungeon, with its systematic destruction of hope and agency, is specifically designed to prevent you from maintaining. The light blade crosses the floor. The morning pottage arrives, is consumed, is insufficient, is nonetheless fuel. The jailer makes his assessment visit. You meet his eyes for slightly longer than you have before, which is a small thing and also, potentially, the beginning of something. Outside, at a distance of several meters of stone and several levels of social hierarchy, the world continues to turn, indifferent to your calculations but not, you are choosing to believe, entirely closed to them. The door that brought you in is the same door that leads out. Someone has the key. There comes a moment, and prisoners who have survived extended medieval imprisonment describe it with a consistency that crosses centuries and languages and individual circumstance, which suggests it is not a personal quirk but a structural feature of the experience, when the dungeon changes. Not physically. The stone remains the stone. The cold remains the cold. The drip continues its faithful metronomic commentary on the passage of time, indifferent to whether anyone is listening. What changes is something in the relationship between you and all of it, a shift in the quality of your attention, subtle as a change in light but as consequential as any of the dramatic events that have punctuated your time down here. You stop waiting for the dungeon to end and start simply being in it, and this shift, which sounds like defeat and sometimes is defeat, is also sometimes the beginning of the only kind of survival that actually counts. You have been here long enough now that the counting of days has become approximate. This is partly the sensory deprivation doing its work on your time perception, and partly a deliberate choice you have made, the choice to stop treating each day as a unit of suffering to be tallied and instead to treat time as something less granular, less countable, less urgently finite. Prisoners who fixated on the count, historical accounts suggest, fared worse than those who found ways to exist in a looser relationship with time. The count made every day a referendum on your situation, a daily reminder of duration, and duration in the dungeon is the enemy. The loosening of time is a coping mechanism of the highest order, practiced by every long-term prisoner from the medieval period to the modern era, arrived at independently by each of them through the same logic of necessity. But the story is not simply one of endurance. The story also has an ending or several possible endings, and this is where medieval dungeon history becomes most interesting and most human. In the ways things concluded, in what happened when the door opened for the last time, in what the people who walked out carried with them into the world that had continued without them. Let us move through these endings together because they illuminate not just the dungeon but everything the dungeon was connected to. The legal systems, the political structures, the social relationships, the economies of power and mercy that governed medieval life at every level. Execution was the ending that the dungeon's architecture most visibly prepared for, and it was common enough that every prisoner who spent significant time underground thought about it with a regularity that said something about the mind's compulsion to rehearse even its worst scenarios. Medieval execution was not, despite popular imagination, exclusively the dramatic public spectacle of the scaffold, though public execution was certainly practiced, with the political and social functions of public spectacle very much in mind. Executions also occurred quietly, within the castle walls, with minimal ceremony and minimal witness, particularly in cases where the prisoner was politically sensitive enough that a public proceeding would raise questions the authorities preferred not to answer. The bodies of such prisoners sometimes simply did not reappear, their fates recorded in administrative documents with the terse efficiency of a system that considered the matter closed. The mainstream historical fact for this final section concerns what happened to the bodies of executed prisoners in medieval England, and it is a fact that illuminates the intersection of law, religion, and social order in ways that reveal the full complexity of the medieval worldview. Under English law, the bodies of executed felons were, in many cases, the property of the crown. They could be displayed, hung in chains at the site of the crime or at significant crossroads, a practice called gibbeting, which served the dual purpose of deterrent and territorial marking, a statement about what happened to people who disturbed the order that the king maintained. They could be given to the emerging institutions of medical education for dissection, a fate considered in medieval and early modern Europe to be a significant additional punishment, both because of the physical desecration involved and because of the theological anxiety about bodily resurrection that dissection raised. Or they could simply be buried, in unconsecrated ground if the crime was serious enough to warrant excommunication, which added the spiritual dimension to the temporal one and was considered by many medieval people to be worse than the execution itself. Not every story that began in the dungeon ended in execution. The historical record, court rolls, administrative documents, chronicles, the occasional personal account, contains a significant population of people who entered dungeons and eventually left them alive, through ransom or pardon or legal resolution or the simple administrative fact of having served whatever purpose their imprisonment was intended to serve. What happened to these people when they emerged is documented with enough frequency to allow some generalizations, and the generalizations are, in their way, as dark as the dungeon itself, though differently dark. The body that emerged from extended medieval imprisonment was not the body that entered it. This is obvious in its way, but the specifics matter. Muscle mass, lost to inactivity and inadequate protein, did not return quickly. Medieval prisoners who had been confined for months or years emerged physically weakened in ways that took months of adequate nutrition and activity to begin reversing. And adequate nutrition was not always immediately available to people whose social and economic circumstances had often deteriorated significantly during their absence. The immune system, suppressed by sustained stress and nutritional deficiency, remained compromised for a period after release, leaving former prisoners vulnerable to illnesses that a healthy person would have resisted easily. The eyes, adapted to dungeon darkness, were genuinely light-sensitive for a period, the medieval equivalent of what we now call photophobia, which contemporary accounts sometimes describe with a vividness that makes it clear the experience was disorienting and painful. Former prisoners sometimes had to be brought into daylight gradually, over days, to allow the visual system to readjust. The quirky historical tidbit for this final section involves the specific legal and social status of people who had been imprisoned and released in medieval Europe, because it reveals something important about how the medieval world understood the relationship between imprisonment and identity. In many medieval legal systems, a person who had been imprisoned, regardless of whether they had been convicted of anything, carried a form of legal and social taint that persisted after release. Their testimony in court was given reduced weight. Their ability to enter into certain legal contracts was compromised. Their eligibility for certain social positions, guild membership, civic office, positions in the church, was affected. They were, in a formal legal sense, diminished persons, their social standing permanently marked by the experience of having been in the dungeon, regardless of the circumstances that put them there. The dungeon, in other words, did not simply confine, it reclassified. It moved you from one social category to another, and the move was not reversible simply by walking out the door. What survived the dark, beyond the body and its complications, was the mind, in whatever form the dungeon had left it. And here the historical record becomes most moving, because what it shows is not simple devastation, not the clean narrative of a system that broke everyone who passed through it, but something more complicated and more human. Some people who emerged from extended medieval imprisonment were, by any measure, profoundly damaged, unable to reintegrate, unable to maintain relationships, prone to the episodes of fear and dissociation and uncontrollable reaction to triggers that we would now recognize as post-traumatic responses. Though the medieval world had no framework for understanding these symptoms as the sequelae of trauma, and instead explained them in theological or humoral terms that were useless for treatment. These people often did not survive long outside the dungeon, dying within months or years of release from conditions, physical, psychological, social, that the dungeon had set in motion. But some people emerged from the dungeon and went on to live lives of extraordinary consequence, and the relationship between their dungeon experience and their subsequent achievement is one of those historical questions that does not resolve neatly but that rewards examination. Thomas Malory, who wrote Le Morte d'Arthur, the great English synthesis of Arthurian legend that shaped the mythology of chivalry for generations, is believed by many scholars to have written significant portions of it while imprisoned, a prisoner composing the definitive celebration of knightly virtue from inside a cell. Marco Polo, imprisoned in Genoa in 1298 after a naval battle, dictated the account of his travels to a fellow prisoner during their confinement, and that account became one of the most influential texts in the history of European exploration. The dungeon, in these cases, did not silence, it concentrated. It removed the noise and the distraction and the social obligations of a free life and left, in the enforced stillness, something that had been there all along but needed the terrible conditions of the dungeon to find its final form. Historians still argue whether this pattern, the creative or intellectual productivity of certain prisoners, represents something meaningful about the dungeon experience, a counter-narrative to the story of pure suffering, or whether it is simply a selection bias in the historical record. The people whose dungeon experiences we know about in detail are, disproportionately, people who were significant enough to leave records, which means they were already people with unusual intellectual or social resources, and those resources expressed themselves even in the most hostile conditions precisely because they were unusual. The ordinary prisoner, the peasant, the minor offender, the person imprisoned on the whim of a local lord with no great resources and no remarkable gifts, left no record of creative productivity, because they left no record at all, and the absence of their record is itself a fact about what the dungeon did to most of the people who passed through it. What the dungeon leaves on history is visible everywhere once you know to look for it. The architecture of the surviving castle dungeons, Chillon, the Tower, Warwick, Conciergerie in Paris, draws millions of visitors a year, people who descend into the same spaces, stand in the same stones, feel the same cold and smell the same mineral damp, and try to imagine the experience from a position of complete safety. The imagination reaches and falls short, and the falling short is appropriate. The dungeon is precisely the kind of place whose reality cannot be fully accessed from the outside, whose specific quality of suffering requires the actual conditions to be properly understood. And the proper understanding is not something any sensible person would choose to pursue. The inscriptions in the walls remain. The name scratched at floor level that you touched in your first week is still there, has been there for centuries, will be there after every currently living person has joined its author in whatever follows this. The tally marks accumulate in their groups of 5. The crude drawings persist. The dungeon's walls are its only uncensored archive, the only place where the experience of the people who actually lived it was recorded without the mediation of scribes or authorities or the self-presentation of people who understood that their words might be read by others. The walls say, I was here. I counted. I scratched my name because I needed something in this place to know it. You are thinking about the name on the wall as the door opens. Not the interrogation room opening, not the jailer's assessment opening, a different opening with a different quality, the kind you have been trying not to build too much hope around because hope is the most dangerous resource in the dungeon. The one most likely to be depleted at a cost you cannot afford. But the opening is real, and the man in the doorway is someone you have not seen before, someone whose clothing and bearing communicate a level of authority above the jailer's, and the document he carries is being held with the significance of something that has been signed by someone who matters. The word is one syllable in the language they speak here. It means you can go. And now, as the story of your dungeon days settles gently into stillness, let the stone walls begin to soften at their edges, the cold to ease just slightly, the darkness to thin like mist burning off a morning field. You have traveled far tonight, down through centuries of stone and silence, through cold and hunger and the long, patient work of survival, and you have arrived at the other side of it, blinking in whatever light finds you. The dungeon is behind you now, receding the way all terrible things recede when we are safe enough to let them. Slowly, incompletely, leaving traces that are also, in their way, a form of knowledge. You know something now that you did not know at the start of the evening. You know what the stone feels like, what the silence weighs, what the body does when it is asked to endure more than it was designed for and does so anyway, because that is what bodies do, what people do, what the long, unrecorded population of medieval dungeons did across the centuries. They endured, and they scratched their names, and they counted the days, and some of them walked out, and all of them mattered. Let your breathing slow now. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Let the muscles of your face release the small tensions they have been holding. Let your hands open if they have been closed. The bed beneath you is soft. The temperature is right. The darkness around you is the safe darkness of a room you chose. A night you can leave whenever you want. The dungeon is history. You are here in the present, in the warmth, and the present is generous and the warmth is real, and you have nowhere to be until morning. The stone is very far away. Let it stay there. Sleep now if you are ready. The journey is complete. The lights are down, and the only sound worth listening to is the soft, continuous sound of your own breathing, easy and slow, carrying you forward into the quiet hours, into the deep and restful dark that is nothing like the other dark, the one we visited tonight. This dark is yours, and it is kind, and it will keep you safely until morning comes to find you, warm and whole and rested, on the other side of sleep. Good night. You made it out.